Welcome to Don't Say Adulting,
a podcast by Grotto Network.
Hosted by Jane O'Connor
And Mike Rossetti.
It's the show where I ask the questions that I want to know.
And also, I'm here too.
Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Welcome back to Don't Say
No.
Adulting.
Say it.
With me and Mike.
Yes.
Me, Jane.
And Mike.
This is the show where we talk about adult problems.
And
adult solutions.
And today's topic, I guess is what I was saying.
And today we're going to be talking about relationships,
love.
Talking about love in the air these days.
Let's talk about it.
And I think one thing that really inspired this topic for me was, I think, in the vein of getting out of that artificial college environment, really navigating relationships after college, and that mostly, like, how do you ask someone out? How do you date? Once you're outside of an environment where everybody's your age, you're all drawn in by a common interest, whether that be the school you're at or the major you're in or whatever social clubs that you're involved in through school. And once all of that's kind of gone and maybe you're single, you didn't find your soulmate in college, what does that world look like, Michael?
Looks like a profile on a smartphone.
Well, that was an interesting thing. It's
like an app download.
I felt like it was easier to avoid dating apps while in college, and I went to a pretty small school. But I did some research.
Okay.
And according to Pew Research, for people under 30...
Are they a trusted source? No,
Pew Research. Sometimes I pull some pretty shady sources, but I think Pew is up there.
Okay, well.
According to Pew, 53% of people under 30 report having used a dating site or app. And that percentage gets smaller as the ages get older. So it's kind of an unavoidable thing, it seems like, at least.
In this day and age, really.
In this day and age. It's not how my parents met. Let me tell you that.
Mine neither.
How did your parents meet?
My mom had just moved to Boston, and someone from Chicago was just like, "Oh, hey, get in touch with this person, also from Chicago." And let's say his name was Kevin. Kevin already had a lady friend at the time, so he didn't want my mom to think it was a date. So he asked this guy he worked with, named Nick Rossetti, "Hey, do you mind coming to meet with this Chicago person, for the sake of to make it not awkward or whatever." So then, anyway, they're at this bar called Tia's in Boston, and evening was going well. My dad and my mom continued to go out for the evening. My mom was actually supposed to meet her boyfriend in New York City the next day and fly to New York from Boston.
Spicy.
My dad was like, "Well, hey, I'll drive you to the airport tomorrow." So my dad picked my mom up, drove her to Logan Airport, and she did not get out of the car.
She didn't get on her plane?
She didn't get on the plane.
Interesting.
They did drive to a payphone, and she called. And she called the guy and broke up with the guy. And she and my dad have been married for 30. They got married in 86.
Yeah.
What's
I
the
guess
math?
Sad for the other guy, but
now
Mike Rossetti is here.
Sounds like it was a schmo. So and yes, it led to this.
I think, and I think that's what people hope for. I mean, I personally don't have anything against dating apps, but it's definitely a world that I avoided exploring while in college.
But it sounds like wasn't a need at the time. Based on what you were saying earlier.
Yeah, and I think I'm now experiencing this world in which, the...
Feeling pressure?
Well, I think there's some of the pressure. It's weird. It's kind of started after college with the parents,
Your parents pressuring you?
Not like pressure, but...
Are you the oldest?
I'm the oldest, yeah.
Oh, okay. But still,
yeah.
When are we going to have grandchildren?
Yeah. I didn't think my parents were that stereotypical, but...
I wonder if deep down everyone really is, even if they say they're not. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, I'm a modern parent.
Yeah.
All they really
but
want
internally they do want
they just want to be a
grandbabies.
grandparent. And
but I think also another interesting thing about the dating app world is, I think, the divergence you see in types of apps, because obviously Tinder is really there to promote kind of a hookup culture.
Is that why it was designed? Is that like...
I think it was. I mean, even the really super visual based swiping mechanism makes it very objectifying in a way, I think, that lends itself to hookup culture, versus a lot of these apps that came out not in response, but as alternatives like Hinge or Bumble that were promoting themselves as a more respectable app.
But there's still like swiping in those, isn't there? And
There's some swiping there's some selecting
I mean,
that
people
goes on.
swipe in real life.
Yeah.
It's just called
And-
you give people the time of day or you don't.
Yeah. And even before apps, there was, OkCupid, Match.com.
And just meeting at a bar.
And meeting at a bar.
Yeah.
But it seems like that's going down in terms of how people date. I mean, I don't know. So I think it just seems like, I've already, even 1 year out of school, noticed a bit of I don't know. Already I feel like I have to change my approach to how I view dating and romantic relationships.
Well, because, are you just hoping to meet someone like naturally, like walking through a park and like a scarf blows?
I don't know. I guess that's how in my mind
gets
I
you
just
tangled
sort of
up and someone helps you.
picture.
Like,
I don't know if that's what most young people want, but I sort of imagine that at least that's how people...
yeah, I mean, every time I go to the grocery store, I'm like, it's today the day.
Today they the
Are we
cashier.
both going to reach for the canned tomatoes at the same time? And it's like, oh.
But I don't know. I think maybe things are changing. There are more, I was going to say maybe based off pop culture, but there are more movies these days that are leaning into the dating app route.
Yeah.
But anyway, this is why we've brought on our guest today.
Yes,
Tim O'Malley, professor of theology at Notre Dame and also director of education at the McGrath Institute for Church Life here.
Impressive credentials.
Well known for a class that he teaches here on marriage and dating and a few books that he's published on the subject. And I think he's well known for this class where you go on a date as an assignment. So I thought he'd be a good...
Probably has some insight.
Good guy to talk to.
Yeah, or at least make for good conversation.
Yeah.
Just like,
So stick around and we will be back
Please.
with Tim O'Malley on Don't Say Adulting. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Don't Say Adulting.
Don't say it.
Jane and Mike, and now joined by our very special guest, Tim O'Malley, professor here at Notre Dame and working with the McGrath Institute. I don't know what your official title is. Is it Director of Education?
Director of Puppetry.
Okay.
No.
Although I heard they do need that over there.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, but thank you so much for coming on to talk about relationships, navigating relationships as an adult, after college into your 20s and 30s. I first heard about you actually because of a class that you teach here. It's apparently well known, where you assign, as an assignment, you have people go out on a date and ask specific questions. So why don't we just start there with why you assign that, what's so important about that, what the goal is, maybe?
Yeah, so it's an extra credit assignment that they have to ask someone out on a date. I assign it because people are terrible at dating. They don't know how to do it. They actually don't know how to talk to people directly, unmediated, sort of via a screen. And so there is like a sense like, oh, you should go on a normal date with someone. It doesn't have to be in a hookup situation. You don't have to be drunk to talk to someone you're interested in perhaps dating. And so it's to sort of try to create a dating culture at Notre Dame by forcing the students to date, to actually realize that they can ask someone out and not die on the other side.
So what are some of the questions that you have them ask, and I guess what's the purpose?
Well,
behind?
I actually have to give them specific questions because they don't know how to talk to each other.
Yeah.
So if they, for example, are just dating, I remind them that normal dating at the beginning isn't, will you marry me? But it's normally things like, where did you grow up? And tell me, do you have siblings? Right? Did you have a elaborate Olympic career in gymnastics? Those are normal first date questions.
Certainly.
Yeah.
Right? And then for those who've been dating for a bit, I have them up the game a little because there's a temptation to not talk about the big issues like, well, we've been dating for 2 years. Are we actually going to ever get married maybe?
How to broach those topics, maybe.
Have we ever thought about what it'd be like to raise kids together? So those sorts of questions to up the game on if they've been dating for a little bit, not for like a month.
Yeah.
I encourage not after
not
a
to
month.
mention that. Not to mention marriage on the first date or...
It's the way to end a relationship.
Yeah. So I guess going back to an earlier stage in that, you alluded to the dating app culture and the mediated by a screen. Do you think that's sort of a cause for a lot of these anxieties related to dating? Mike and I were talking about how at least for me, when I was in college, it felt like there was so much in-person communication. It was a small school. And then leaving college, I'm now in a world where I feel very detached from people my age. And so dating apps feel like the avenue to meeting those kinds of people. Do you think that's mostly had negative effects? Do you see any like positive aspects there? Or how do you really, navigate that?
Yeah, I mean, and people like to beat up on dating apps. I think dating apps help you meet people potentially, right? That can be used, as they often are in like big cities, as who in this bar right now would like to go home and hook up, right? That's one of the primary uses of dating apps in big cities. I don't think that has to be used in that way. I actually find the screen to be much more complicated to not be dating apps, but texting and any form of communication that's curated instead of direct. So, you never send a direct text message to anyone about anything without having 8 friends sort of look at it and curate it and make sure that it's going to produce the right reaction.
Yeah.
So they're terrified to like call me on the phone to talk about their work, right? The voice, the sort of intimacy of it. So it's really this kind of like indirect textual communication that's the problem, dating app or not.
Okay. So you would advise, whichever way you go, maybe not asking someone out through text or ending something through text.
That's the requirement of the assignment, is to actually talk to the person in person to say, I would like you to go out on a date with me. Would you like to go out on a date with me? Many don't obey it, and they suffer the consequences, which is ambiguity for like 2 weeks before they figure out if the person really wanted to go out on a date with them.
Okay. I thought you were going to say the consequences, like a C- for the assignment.
Yes, I failed them.
Yeah. If you go through text.
This extra credit assignment.
I also,
no, you'll fail in life if you do that. Really.
I post it publicly too. I post it publicly if they, no.
I was like, whoa.
That just makes it harder for them to date in the future.
Exactly, yeah.
You failed the dating class.
Mm-hmm.
So then, sorry, if they go on the date and follow through, then just type up a report for you and tell you?
They have to basically figure out what they learned, and each of these is its unique portrait of what they've learned. Some of them have been hooking up with this person for a couple months, and they're like, I actually kind of have a crush on them. I'd like to take them out. Some of them, are awkward and have never actually had a conversation, and so they reflect on the awkwardness of having a conversation and how they sort of got into it. The one thing that I find very interesting, almost every one of the assignments, the number one interest of the students, they know if a date went well, if it was flowing. There's like a fear that something doesn't flow and that for a moment it's awkward and therefore it's bad. So they all want the date to flow.
Yeah, which I guess over text that kind of eliminates that, because the flow is really just... It's normal to kind of wait for a response for 5 minutes, which in person, that would be super weird if somebody kind of paused for 5 minutes.
And I think they expect that. I think they expect, like, if you are having a normal conversation with someone you don't know that well, then automatically it's going to be uncomfortable and awkward, but it doesn't have to be.
Right.
Would you say that it's more about embracing the uncomfortable awkwardness in that way, or is it more and seeing that as a part of the journey of getting to know someone that curating sort of bypasses and maybe has consequences for down the line?
Yes, I would see it exactly like you said it. You should just re-put that in there.
Okay.
And then that's exactly right.
Well, I'm just wondering, because you said it doesn't have to be that way. Are you saying like there's a way to avoid the awkwardness, or just it's really just pushing through?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, there are some ways. Again, there are practices and normal human conversation skills that we learn, right? When I'm on an airplane with someone and we're adults, we start by having a conversation. We know, like, oh, so where are you from and where'd you grow up? And, I don't text them and say, like, use emojis as a primary mode of communication.
Facial expression through.
Yeah. So they learn, you have to learn to have human conversations, like you have to learn all these sorts of things.
Okay. And do you think that is a newer problem for the younger generation? We've talked about screens a lot, so that kind of implies that.
I think it is a new problem. It's a sort of, not growing up in where primary communication unfolds in that mode, right? You get to meet someone on Instagram and drop a message in their DM, and that's your communication. You've spent 75 hours curating that message instead of just saying like, hi, my name's Tim.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and I guess there's the big thing. Well, I always see the fear of rejection as a big thing, and in person that feeling so much harsher. I feel like I always see that meme, which is like the worst she can say is no, and then a text bubble that says like LOL as an even worse response to no. What do you have to say about like responding to rejection? Maybe more from the male side. I don't actually know who that would specifically. I guess anybody can be rejected. That's the human fear.
And many are.
Many in this room.
Many in this room.
Speak for yourself, Jen.
There are a lot more people back there that you can't see.
Exactly. All rejected. So, yeah, I mean, I joke with the students and say, then that's one less person in the world that actually you have to worry about as a potential option. But rejection is going to happen. And I think there's two sides of this rejection problem. There's the fear of being rejected, and we put too much of ourself into going out on any particular date to begin with, right? I mean, it's a date, right? This is not a judgment of your whole personal existence. This person is not attracted to you. There are many people who will not be attracted to you. Enjoy this. But then second, right, like, well, how do you receive a rejection or give a rejection, right? I mean, a lot of people are afraid to reject, right, to say, like, I'm not interested because they don't want to offend. And so they maintain this sort of ambiguity in the rejection. So it's more like, hey, like, well, maybe I'll go out with you one day. This is terrible. It's much better to just be like, listen, I enjoy you, but I'm not attracted to you in this way. And hey, thanks for taking the risk. I mean, that's a risky thing you did. And, I know that it's risky. Thanks for doing it. But it's just, I'm not attracted in that way. So like both taking rejection and giving rejection.
Okay. So on that giving rejection side, like I have some friends who have like a one date policy where they'll say yes to even one date, even if they're not that interested. But do you think maybe if you already know you're not interested, just kind of cutting that off or nipping that in the bud?
It's kind of hard when you get to be an adult. I mean, I've had friends who are like, okay, so I didn't feel a lot after one date. I'm like, yeah, that's normal because you had coffee together for 45 minutes.
No.
I mean, we're talking and I'm not attracted to either of you right now.
Mike's
I will
really
thank you
trying.
for your honesty.
Yeah. Right. So, I mean, it takes part of attraction and falling for someone is getting to know them and spending time with them. And so, it's especially as you get into adult life, you don't have these like college relationships where, you share your whole life together overnight for 4.5 hours. You have 45 minutes for coffee. You might need to have coffee about 4 or 5 times to realize that the person like secretly has a collection of like cat statues in their house, and that's just not of interest to you.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's been the big thing.
Rule of 3 is what I usually hear from
for
my
dates.
friend. Yeah,
I thought you meant cat statues.
No, yeah.
3 cat statues.
You're allowed 3 cat statues, and after that, it's a problem.
It's done. Yeah.
So rule of 3 is in 3 dates.
Yeah, 3 dates,
Okay.
and that kind of being
That kinda works.
the threshold. But
Yeah.
4 or 5 sounds good too, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's something that you kind of alluded to this, the college thing. Now that I'm a year out, college actually has a lot of implied similarities. Or if you're at the same college, it's a small school or something, you're taking the same class, it seems like you get past a lot of those first hurdles. There's the age thing, you're all the same age. You probably have some similar reason that drew you to a specific major or class or college even. And that seems to cut out a lot of that middle discussion aspect. Maybe you're in the same friend group that's really large. I mean, that's the thing that I felt has been really absent outside of college, is that similarly age-minded automatic group that's just there for me. And so I could see how maybe then it would take even more dates to really get to that point where you're like, oh, okay, this is someone I can have a conversation with and kind of move past.
Yeah, and that's why I think young adults need to form groups of people, right? I always tell my students the best way to actually ask someone out on a date is to be friends with them, right? And to actually know something about them. It's if you think about dating as a strategy to randomly ask out stranger in bar, you're going to take a lot of shots before you hit anything potentially. That sounds terrible. I mean,
No, yeah.
I didn't mean it.
Yeah.
I didn't mean that as violently as it sounded.
Yeah. The other person is a target. That you really...
exactly. Yeah, that was reductionistic. So, but like young adults who form running clubs or go hiking together or spend time doing something they're committed to, right? Even sort of in church groups or whatever. Right, this is an opportunity to meet people where there's at least some shared values and possibilities to develop friendships. And so I think that's an excellent space needed for this dating. And then older people have a role, too. I mean, we have to help young people meet each other. That's why I assign a date.
Okay. So that's where you see your role in this.
Oh, yeah, and we have marriages come out of the class.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I don't mean to brag, but yes, I do.
Maybe that's why it's
What are the numbers? Do you have them?
I mean, it's not huge. It's about 75%. No. Right. There's a number of, I get about 2 to 3 per class of folks that have been dating long term and then get married from the dating assignment. So
I think this might be switching things up a little. But in that vein of dating apps, I feel like among my peers and young people, especially when it's early to mid 20s, the concept of like the hookup culture seems to be really prevalent and something that I think people do freely engage in with this assumption that they'll kind of settle down later. And I'm not trying to turn this into a big moral lesson as to what you should do, but do you find that to be damaging to commitment and interpersonal relations in general?
Yeah, I mean, hooking up is really about ambiguity. It's not about just sexual desire unleashed on any person in the whole world. Anyone who's tried to regularly hook up knows that it's complicated. Dating apps makes it a little smoother, but it's somewhat complicated. You know, studies like Christine Emba's Rethinking Sex is a great book, and notes in particular very big sort of gender differences around like reactions to hookups. A lot of women don't want to hook up. The consequences for hooking up for women are much more real in all sorts of ways than for men. And a lot of men are unhappy with it. So, yeah, I mean, I don't think it's a great sort of habit if you want to practice committed relationships over the long haul. You know, one-off relationships through dating apps, no commitment, right? I mean, it's one thing when someone's there when they want to have sex with you. It's another when you're vomiting in a toilet because you're sick, right? And hopefully with dating, we're moving towards someone being there when you're vomiting in a toilet because you have the stomach bug rather than I want something out of you on this particular night.
Yeah. And I could see how the ambiguity thing I think feeling already just kind of unmoored in your 20s, just adding on these layers of relational complication that I think, I guess just you don't realize are causing harm.
Yeah, we all want to be desired, right?
Yeah.
But you feel like in some ways you can't, right? So you want someone to desire you, and so hooking up is a mode of feeling desired, but without the commitment, which you're actually kind of terrified perhaps to make because you're like, well, I don't even know if I'm going to live here next year. So, I have this desire to get married, but on the other hand, I'm not even committed to my apartment, let alone, this city.
Yeah. In terms of dating apps, seems like with the hookup culture, we have apps like Tinder that really lend themselves more to that versus a growing number of apps like Bumble or Hinge that really hinge on the idea of being more long term. I think Hinge's motto is like designed to be deleted or something with this idea that you'll meet someone long term. Do you see, you kind of mentioned that in a big city that could be a good avenue. Is there a way to appropriately use dating apps that can work within, healthy relationships?
Yeah, I mean, I think you'd have to think about how you treat the other person, right, with the dating app and stay away from ones that objectify the person you're actually looking at, right? I mean, if the dating app has sort of, swipe left, swipe right with a curated photo itself, right? So, someone took 45 selfies so that they would have their lips look like a duck and, they are wearing the right sort of thing and, they're
carrying the bigger fish.
Exactly. Yeah. They're carrying, yes, the meme. So, right. If they look like that, and then you're like, oh no, that's in, I'm out. And you also like, the goal is to use them to not use them. Right. So you want to meet someone, you don't want to, keep using them, but it can form us in habits, just like Amazon, right?
Right.
I shop right away now because Amazon's easy.
Yeah.
Can form you in a habit where you're like, well, I'm not happy, so time to jump on Tinder or Hinge or even Bumble and do something about it.
Yeah. So you mentioned that the biggest thing in the report is often like the awkwardness. Do you ever have just the biggest problems people seem to face or people who just really struggle with asking someone out?
No, they just, a lot of the times it's, the problem really is just the discomfort in making yourself available. And people do get rejected and they feel like it's their fault, right? There's a lot of type A people in the world or people who judge their own worth by like they view marriage and dating as like a success game. Either I'm going to win it or I'm going to lose it. And so why am I such a loser? Like that's a thing I read all the time. And I'm like, well, you're not a loser, but you're 22 or 23 and you're dating at Notre Dame and you're super smart and you could meet someone in your job, but you might not meet someone here because, to be honest, you're kind of too much of a nerd here. And that's great. Congratulations.
Yeah.
You're going to win in the long term. Right? Like nerds win in the end, the very end.
Noted.
Okay, so that was all those questions were sort of related to getting into a relationship, which is more what I want to focus on. But do you have any tips, advice for being in a relationship? It's pretty serious, maintaining things, keeping things healthy, with the long haul in mind.
Yeah, I mean, talk to each other, like each other. I've been married for 17 years, and I actually like my wife. We like talking to one another. We're not those sorts of people. I think it's impractical to say, like, make sure you keep the romance alive you can't keep the romance alive at every moment as you get older, because life is exhausting. And you have to bathe your children, and there's only so much.
Children need bathing.
Yes. And there's only so much romance. And so, I think you should like each other. You should talk about serious things with each other. You should be honest with each other. You should have fun together. You should laugh together. For me, our faith is very important. So we should pray together and go to mass together for us. And, that's integral to who we are. And I think you should delight in the other. And hey, when that itch comes, right, especially if you're young, right, 2 years into a relationship and you're like, oh no, like suddenly I'm not attracted. Maybe pause for a moment and wonder how true that is, or if it's just the sort of itch that you get when you're kind of bored.
Yeah.
And you're like, for your assignment or for that class even, like, do you have your students think about like what their values are and what they're looking for in another person, or do you just kind of talk about?
Some of them do. I don't necessarily have it, because they tend to then reduce like those values to things like, I want someone who, is 6'2" and, a strong athlete and can throw a shot put over I don't know where you throw a shot put, but can throw it somewhere. But I think that values come out. And I think I often hear students, right, one of the things that come up if they're in a relationship is like religious differences. Like, oh, what does this mean for us? Or, you see other values come out. Like, I want a job that's fulfilling to me, but you want one of the partners to not work. So what does this mean? And so that's one of the good parts of the long-term dating assignment that I give, which is it forces them to have those conversations now instead of year 2 of marriage.
Yeah. And I'm guessing there aren't really hard and fast rules for deal breakers, because I think about this value thing a lot, about how often it's really surface level interests that draw you into someone, taste in music, movies, and
physicality.
Then, yeah, exactly. Their height, 6'2". But it's often these major deal breakers that people have with like faith things, but often it just depends on the weight that you put to that. So do you have any things that you consider to be major? I don't use the word red flags because that's more of like a relational thing, but for students that you advise against?
Yeah, if you root for the Yankees or the Lakers, you're out.
Whoa.
As far as I'm concerned, you're not worth being with. No, I mean, I think a lot of the deal breakers are actually more interpersonal in communication than like characteristics. So, if you are religious and you're dating someone who's not religious and they're hostile towards your religious values, that's gonna be a problem, and you gotta deal with it now. If you have a different view of what like finances are gonna be, that's probably something to deal with now. None of these things are deal breakers because we can work them all out with one another, right? I mean, there are some obviously like violence or anything like that, but these are the kinds of things that you have to work with.
Okay. So, because you talked about how people in longer relationships, it's good to have these conversations like 2 years in, talk about the finance aspect, the kids aspect. Are these usually things that you think, I mean, you mentioned people can work through to a certain extent, but is there a certain point where it's like, oh, you should probably give this one up or end it? Or, I don't know, I guess the process of ending a relationship seems so sad, but advice on that front?
Yeah, I mean, if there's not commitment, there can be ends. And I talk to students, right? I mean, obviously this class generates interest, so students come talk to me about their dating lives, and it's clear at some points that this is over, right? The guy is only vaguely calling sometimes. The girl is disappeared entirely from the life of the person. they're not really able to get by some of these things. Jealousy, for example. Jealousy is a huge thing, right? Where they're consistently jealous and it's actually doing harm to personal life and they're controlling. And they've had an intervention and the person's basically like, I won't do it anymore, but then they keep doing it. Sometimes those are just occasions to end a relationship. And, you know, it's hard. It's not a failure. It's part of the discernment. And if the person who's wounded in this, right? I mean, the person who's broken up with, I mean, both are wounded, but, you know, might be an invitation to reflect on some things they need to change the next time they're in a relationship, right? Maybe jealousy is a problem. Why am I jealous? What would I do the next time to not be so jealous with this person and make them feel like, you know, I want to put cameras in their house and see every one of their moves.
God.
Red flag, I would
That
say.
is a red flag. And I find Lakers fans, that's what they do.
Oh my
It's the
God.
camera thing.
I'm not gonna say all Lakers fans, but all people who do that are Lakers fans.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Is that okay?
Yes, absolutely.
Thanks for the clarification.
Yeah. Do you think? Sorry, this is just a last minute question because I don't think a romantic relationship is the be all end all to, you know, living as a person. Do you have any advice for navigating singlehood if you feel like that's your calling?
Gosh, we got to do like a lot better with friendship. I mean, I always tell my undergraduates that my class is secretly about friendship, which is we're not good at friends, you know, long-term friendships and commitments and friendships of supporting one another, right? It's sort of like, okay, well, I had friends when I was young, but now that I'm an adult, it's time to move on and have spouses and children. But we need friends. We need people in our lives no matter what. And, you know, we're committed and can sort of live into these friendships that provide us, you know, can sustain us throughout our lives. We need relationships. Not everything has to be long-term romantic commitments.
Yeah. Is there anything else that maybe we didn't cover that you feel is really important for young people or old people, honestly, you know, to consider with regards to relationships?
Yeah, I mean, just take them seriously. They're the best part of life. In some ways, I mean, not everybody will find themselves in a long-term committed relationship. You know, there are people who will be single for a long time, but sort of in a kind of world where a lot of the focus tends to be on, right, success and career success, I think it's somewhat important to remember that actually when you're dying, your boss probably won't be there unless he's killed you. And then ironically, yeah, he'd be there. But other than that unique situation, it's going to be your spouse, your kids, you know, these folks are the ones who are there. And so these relationships matter a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that covers all aspects of
the
human
tea.
relationships.
Yeah, that's it.
No, this has been great. Thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, man, it's been great. Thank you.
Yeah. And thank you guys for tuning in to Don't Say Adulting.
Say it.
And we'll see you guys next time.
Ciao for now. Don't Say Adulting is a Grotto Network podcast produced by Jane O'Connor, Mike Rossetti, Kevin DeClute, and Josh Long. Additional production editing done by Kevin DeClute. Graphics and animation by Becky Rogers. Grotto Network is Director Javi Zubizarreta, Senior Producer Josh Long, Senior Content Editor Jesse McCartney, Art Director Becky Rogers, Senior Manager for Community Engagement Mike Rossetti, Social Media Manager Adrian Garaldi, Web Content Strategist Michaela Douglas, Producer Kevin DeClute, Associate Producer Jane O'Connor. Special thanks to our guest and Notre Dame Studios.